Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and we're going to continue our discussion with Barry Duvall about the Civil War and Muhlenberg County. There's many battles during the Civil War, and you mentioned them in your book. How many of these battles did Muhlenberg Countyans fight in? Were they the big battles, or just all of them, or completely spread out?
A lot of them. You'll find once I started digging into the soldiers, I followed them by units first of all, just to see what battles the units that I knew that our soldiers engaged in. And among those, for the Union Army, I followed the 11th Kentucky Infantry, the 17th Kentucky Infantry, the 3rd Kentucky Cavalry, and then for the Confederacy, I followed the 9th Kentucky Infantry, Helm's 1st Kentucky, and Johnson's 10th Kentucky Cavalry. I also followed the movements for as long as I knew that Colonel Martin was with Forrest, I followed Forrest movements. And then when he went with John Hunt Morgan, I started following Morgan's movements and researching their involvements in battles. And yeah, so like the Orphan Brigade, we talk about how that came to be. There's romantic stories. Nobody knows really exactly how that term came to be. Some say that, in Tennessee, Breckinridge was watching the 9th Kentucky involved, and they were being decimated. And they said he sobbed and sighed, and he said, "My poor orphans." And they think that was probably the first they had heard of it. I think it was probably already discussed in their circles. But the 9th Kentucky was everywhere. I mean, they moved throughout the South. They were at Vicksburg. They were at Shiloh, Baton Rouge. They were over in East
all over the place. Yeah,
everywhere. Wherever the fighting was, and they followed those lines. And there are several Muhlenberg County soldiers in those groups that you will find all the way to the surrender in Georgia. And it's interesting because they were there, the day of, and went home. You find a reference to Colonel Martin, served under Forrest and Morgan. Benjamin Hardin Helm, I thought, well, the significance of him, when we talk about the first Kentucky. Helm was some of Lincoln's own family didn't support him from the get-go.
Yep.
Benjamin Hardin Helm was a lawyer. He practiced here in Owensboro quite a bit. But he was married to the sister of the First Lady, Mary Todd Lincoln. Her name was Emily Todd. And Benjamin Hardin Helm was married to her. And so he's the one that, he became the general of the 1st Kentucky Confederate Brigade. And then there was another brother of, I'm pulling these names, become very significant. Yeah. Anybody talks about Alexander Todd. He was a brother to Mary Todd Lincoln. And Alexander Todd was then selected to be an aide-de-camp for Helm because it seemed to be a safe spot. Generals, they lead, but at the same time, most of the time, they're not right up front.
In the back, calling the shots.
That's right. They're on the hillside over in the back, say, let's do this, and sending
Mm-hmm.
orders. So it was believed that Todd wanted to be a part of this, so a safe place would be by the general's side. And the significance of Alexander Todd, he had lived for a long time in Muhlenberg County. He had
Mm-hmm.
actually gone to the first inaugurational event for President Lincoln from Muhlenberg County. Came back
Wow.
right
Wow.
before he got that gig to be the aide de camp for Helm. He was an overseer for about 2,000 acres of land that belonged to their uncle, a man by the name of D.C. Humphreys. Humphreys owned this 2,000 acres, which was an old uh, part of a Revolutionary War grant, and it had been
Mm-hmm.
passed down. Anyhow, so Todd lived there, and he was very well liked. But somehow, that again, households were divided, families divided, friends. So Helm and Todd are both in the Confederate Army now, and in safe spots. So their story, we can talk some about that. But I follow that. Alec Todd was killed at Baton Rouge, to give you some idea, with Helm's brigade. They were down there, and they had ridden too far forward uh, just before sunrise, before a battle. It was after Vicksburg had fallen in 1863.
Mm-hmm.
They were down in Baton Rouge, and they'd ridden too far forward and realized that they had done so. When they turned back, they were the reports say that there was an accident or
Mm-hmm.
an incident. More or less, it was a friendly fire situation, much like that killed Stonewall Jackson. But
Yeah.
Alec Todd was actually killed in that incident, and Helm was wounded. And I've actually held the telegrams where he wrote to his sister, and he said, "Sadly, on this day, your brother is dead. I'm
Yeah.
badly
Wow.
wounded. I will be home soon."
Mm-hmm.
And a handful of telegrams in the Kentucky Historical Society that have been
Wow.
preserved. Helm was killed during the war as well, but it was later.
Yeah.
But I just followed those troop movements, and it's far out, and I thought, all right, let's just see who we can find. I find one soldier that I can find was at the Battle of Gettysburg. I can't see his engagement. I find one or two soldiers that could have been at least one in Andersonville, maybe two, if I'm remembering right, Andersonville prison. Of course, a lot of them were in the Camp Chase prison. I find a African American soldier at the Battle of Petersburg in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Remember the crater? I find him fighting there, and they were all over
Yeah.
in small groups. But I count any soldier that was born, lived, or died in Muhlenberg County
Mm-hmm.
as a Muhlenberg County soldier. And
Mm-hmm.
so by doing
So,
so, I see a vast array of battles that they were engaged in.
yeah, and yeah, involved in pretty much all over the place. Now, we talked about this a lot, and we've talked about the guerrilla warfare a lot, kind of over different episodes and stuff. But Muhlenberg County, you got Morgan, you got guerrilla warfare, Quantrell. All of that's one kind of big thing. I mean, over the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So how much? I guess how many raids took place? Do you think? Or is that too big of a question?
No, it's not. Uh, to understand the raids and the raiders, uh, early on it was discovered in the Confederate Army that one of the shortcomings they would have would be manpower. And so the Confederate government actually enacted something called the Partisan Ranger Act. And I don't have it in front of me, but it more or less said, hey, if you've got the money to do it and want to do it, we will recognize you as your own military entity under the auspice of the Confederate Army, if you want to put it
Yeah.
together. Hence, you have these guys. You have Morgan and Forrest and Quantrill. Let's just pick those three.
Mhm.
They raise their own, groups. I guess they're regiments at this point. Some of them not that big, some of them are larger than others. But if they had the money and could put it together, it's like, well, grab your horse, grab your gun, let's go. And then they put them down on paper as, you're now a member of Forest, uh, uh, cavalry, or you're a member of John Hunt Morgan's cavalry. And of course, after the book was released, I learned that Forrest actually loved Muhlenberg County. Now, I haven't figured out exactly when he discovered this, but he would come to Greenville to buy his leather goods. There was a tanner by the name of Campbell. There's actually a Nathan Bedford Forrest historian in Nashville. I believe his name is Steve Ford. And he told me one day, just in conversation, he said, "Who's the tanner in Greenville in whatever year?" And I told him, I said, "Well, I know who it was, and I know where his tannery was." He said, "Nobody's ever told me that." But Campbell, he was first name right now, ran a tanning facility there in town. And apparently Forrest would either come there personally or send for his leather goods there.
Wow.
Forrest was there often. Morgan came through there. After the Battle of Perryville, John Hunt Morgan moved west as a diversionary tactic while the Confederate Army vacated to the eastern part of the state, moving out. And he brought, some estimates are 1,800, maybe more, mounted troopers through to the west. He came in up at Scilesville. He spent the night that night with Silas House Brewer, guy that ran the mill up there. He was the same guy that was there that talked Buckner into not destroying the lunk, you remember. So he was a Confederate sympathizer, but so the officers spent the night there. They rode into Greenville, the 1,800 strong, and they're war-hardened veterans, not necessarily formally trained military people. And some of the letters you read were, at every stop, they picked up everything they could. We're talking October, I think it's October, let me get it here for you. Is that 1862? They run together, Battle of Perryville. Well, October.
Yeah.
And so they took all the bedding and they took all the food stores and they went through the meat houses and everything they could. And so there's letters written to by local government appealing to the federal government. You got to help us. We're going to be hungry and cold. We have nothing left. So these 1,800 mounted troopers, and I guess they must have had wagons. They were carrying it heavily.
Yeah.
So they spent the day in Greenville shopping. Can you imagine? They came in, they cleaned everything out, just like they did when Buckner came through, and people were scared. And then they went on south and stayed at a place out there, Joseph Reynolds had a place out there, spent the night there on his farm. And it snowed that night. It was unseasonably warm on Saturday, but Sunday it snowed. And they said when
typical Kentucky, I guess.
Yeah, that's what it is. When Basil Duke was out on the porch and looked at those mounted soldiers down there laying down, and they're laying under these nice quilts and pieces that they had been stealing everywhere. And it was about 3 inches of wet snow laying on every one of them. And then they sent him to the assembly, and he said it was as if Gabriel had sounded the horn. It was like graves were opening up, and these soldiers pulled off the ground. He said it was something to see. Some of them went to church. They went to Friendship Church, and they went up to the nearby church. They asked Morgan or Duke or whoever they had to ask to get permission. They said, "We would like to attend church up here," So they go half a mile back up the road to Friendship Church. Services started. And these muddy, wet soldiers come marching. They were walking in and take part in the service, but they don't want to be there. Service was holding a little while, so they left, and service was still going on. And when the service let out, you had a whole bunch of mad wives and women, because when they went outside, there wasn't a horse, buggy, wagon to be found. They had taken everything. Had cleaned
Oh
up,
gosh.
moved on down the road. They were headed toward Hopkinsville at that point. And
Yeah.
but we had different raiders, and of course Martin would visit home pretty often. Uh,
Hmm.
Robert Maxwell Martin. They said he would ride into town, shoot them up. He'd set pickets around Greenville, have shootouts, and he took some. I think they were the 35th Kentucky cavalry, or they might have been mounted infantry. Cavalry. The difference between fighting on a horse or jumping off your horse and fighting, but
Yeah.
they were, and that also meant that his brother was in town because he was a Union soldier, and he had been there to see his brother. But he told his guys, he said, "Get them all." He arrested a bunch of soldiers there in town, and they took the things they wanted, just like ever before. They would get really shook up. It was always a lot of action. Let's talk about General Lyon, Highland Lyon from down around what is it called, Eddyville. One of the last things that took place there was his ride through Central Kentucky, burning courthouses. And until I started this project, I always had this idea that he was just riding and creating terror. But as it turns out, the courthouses that he burned were specific. Muhlenberg County's history says the townspeople, regardless of their sentiment, rose up and they climbed on top of buildings with every gun and every stone and every weapon, every piece they could find, and was ready to ambush Lyon and his men. Was going to let them burn the courthouse.
Yeah.
Nothing worse to me, well, a lot of things are bad, but it would be bad for a historian to lose all those records,
Exactly.
And but he never showed. And some of the local people's like, yeah, he heard about us. He's not coming. Had nothing to do with. He had good intelligence telling him that the courthouse in Hopkins County had something there. It would either be supplies for the Union Army, or they could have been using it to house runaway slaves. And the different courthouses that he burned, I can't remember how many there were, all had something in common. That it was he was actually, it was still a military attack on his behalf. Muhlenberg County didn't have either thing going for him, and therefore it was allowed, that he never came there, and it had nothing to do with the people going to protect it. But he rode very close to it. He came across the north end of Muhlenberg County in his ride, and they thought sure he was coming there to burn the courthouse, but he never showed up. Thank goodness.
Yeah. Thank goodness. That's true. I talked with Miles Hoskins about Montgomery County history, and the flip happened. The Union troops were there, and they came. The Confederate guerrillas, I guess, if you want to say it that way, came and burnt, fought them and burnt down the courthouse, and all that good information lost.
We've been real fortunate. Muhlenberg County's been very fortunate because we still have the original record books to 1798, 1799, when it all started. It's right around New Year's of 1799. We always say 1798. The decision process was there, and by 1799, all the papers were signed. So it was right there at that time.
It's one of the earlier. Well, I say earlier counties, but before 1800, I would consider you an earlier county. So what was when was the last raid in Muhlenberg County? Because once that raid happens, that's pretty much the last bit of stuff.
There were a couple of stirrings. I'll tell you about the last one. I'll tell you about Quantrill. His was interesting. That was an interesting find. It got really good because I hear some of the historians, or I've read some of the historians' accounts of this is what happened and that's what happened. But I was able to find some journals of at least three persons, plus the historical accounts of people like Otto Rother and things like that. And they talk about Quantrill coming to Muhlenberg County, and he had been moving in from the west. He had had an engagement let's see, it was over in Caldwell County, and well, one of his men there, but they kept coming, moving to the east from the west. And when they rode into Greenville, when they rode into, let's actually back up, let's go to Nortonville over in Hopkins County.
Mm-hmm.
They were wearing Union uniforms, and they were like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And there was a man over there by the name of Dixon Davis that had some horses, some pretty good horses. And anybody can read about the accounts, you know, as they moved further east, they cleaned up a lot of good thoroughbred horses too, you know, in the east. But Dixon Davis had some horses, and he said it would do me honor to be able to ride along with you, fine Union man, if I can. You know, here's my horse, here's my horses. Can I ride along with you for a piece? You know. Well, they were really put out by it, but you know, they're going to humor him. They probably could have just shot him right there instead of letting him live 2 more days. But, Dixon Davis rode with them, and the journal accounts tell about their ride into Greenville. And they got there, and there were two hotels in on the street in Greenville. There was the Greenville Hotel, which is on the east side of North Main Street. And on the west side, over on the corner, was the Reno House Hotel. And one was held Confederate sympathies, and the other one was Union sympathies. There were some shootouts and some arguments in the street, and we could talk about that at a different time. I'd love to discuss it. But yeah, when they rode into town wearing Union blue, the journals that I find say there was about 60 men, and I was able to confirm from these writings that among them were Jesse James, Frank James, Jim Younger. Cole Younger apparently was not with them. I've tried everywhere in the world to place him there, but no one mentions Cole Younger's actions. But at least you have those 3 members of the latter James and Younger gang. You know, they were all bloodthirsty outlaws. I mean, they were rough dudes. But they went to dinner at the Reno House. And of course, everybody's excited to see them there. You know, this is January 1865, near the end of the war. Things are a little calmer now, and good Union men in town. They had a good dinner. They rode on out toward Drakesboro, spent the night again. They headed on out Highway 70, going toward, remember, we got to talk about east and west, west, east. You know, they're heading to Scilesville, the Rochester area. Well, they'd about had all of the flap and trap they could handle from Dixon Davis, and so they jumped off their horses or whatever and invited him out just off the side of the road there and shot him point blank in the head. One of the 60. And I'd read these accounts, and I read about it in some of the journals. I'm like, well, this really happened. So I finally found the grave of Dixon Davis, and his grave marker states killed January 22nd, 1865. So written in stone, it confirms all the stories. Yeah. Just that way. You know, as a side note, there was another unit, Colonel Barnett, I think was his name, Barnett from over in McLean County, I think he was, maybe McLean. Don't hold me to that. Yeah, he had a company of soldiers, 20 or so, and they wanted to accompany Quantrill. He was going by the name of Colonel Clark. Clark's his middle name, but Colonel Clark, a good Union man, and wanted to ride with him further east. Well, the way I figured out who was with him is because in the journal entries they talked about how they killed 20 men, no problem whatsoever. It wasn't an out-and-out fight. Because they would ride along, Quantrill would give an order, and it was a hidden order, and it went like this. He would say, let's just say Jim, or Jim Younger. All right, Jim Younger had a job to do, and he'd ride it beside one of the real Union soldiers. He'd say, hey, right up here are some Confederate sympathizers in that house. It's about a mile off the road. Let's go back there and give them what for. So a couple of the fake Union soldiers, the Quantrill's gang, would get this one Union soldier to ride out, and they'd get just beyond earshot, and they'd kill him. They'd kill him. And this went on for miles and miles, and nobody was. They separated them out, the 20 among the 60, or the 10 or 20. I think the 18 or 20 of them. They separated them out, and they picked them one at a time. Quantrill would give the order to get rid of them, and they knew what that meant. The last man to die was Colonel Barnett. and I can't think of the guy's name that wrote it. It's in my book. He said Quantrill gave the order. He called. He said Jesse, and he said Jesse knew. Jesse James knew that it was time for the last man to die, and he said. So Jesse rides forward up behind Colonel Barnett and none of his men, because Barnett had just looked at Quantrill and said, "I don't see any of my men back there. Where's my guys?" And he said, so Quantrill says, Jesse rides up behind him. And as Barnett turns around to look once more, Jesse's got his piece leveled at his head and pulls the trigger, falls from his horse, grabs the rein. They continue on up the road. That was Quantrill's last raid into Kentucky.
Wow.
Bloody and colorful, but that was his pass through. And it's interesting.
That's crazy.
You talk about Colonel Martin. He had that deal where he tried to burn he was going to burn the city of New York. I don't know if we did that one. And he was wounded twice, and then he was sent to Canada to recovered. In the meantime, the Confederate government was grasping at straws, and they said, "Let's hit them where it hurts. Let's destroy Chicago and New York." So Muhlenberg County's Colonel Martin was given the responsibility to burn the city of New York, and he gathered up a group of qualified soldiers, put them in plain clothes, and they went into New York down Broadway and moved in these hotel rooms. And they had this new type of fuel that burned very hot, very fast, and they were going to use it. Well, at 7 o'clock that night, whatever time it was, they set fire to all these hotels. Most everything, if not all of them, burned out quickly. They had failed to do the research. It was it was a cold night, and none of them had thought to open a window, so they starved for oxygen and burned down to almost nothing before they were discovered and then easily put out. So they weren't successful in burning New York City, which would have been a guerrilla attack, if you ask me. But that was the brainchild of Robert Maxwell Martin from Greenville to do this. He laid it on. And what's interesting, on Broadway that night performing was John Wilkes Booth and the Booth brothers. And I often wonder if Booth might have taken some information about that guerrilla attack, because it was much very similar to the attack on the Lincoln administration when the president was assassinated. But Booth was there on Broadway that night when Martin's men tried to burn the city down. But back to why is this significant? So Martin starts moving toward Richmond. He's headed to Richmond. That's where the Confederate government's at. And en route, he crosses paths with Quantrill's men who had just left Greenville. I find these networks, and I can find the interaction. What did they discuss? What did they do? Who saw what? Who was fighting? And Martin was given the task. He was asked to take on the task of saving the president, Davis, the Confederate president. And he did carry him for a short ways as they moved south. But again, Muhlenberg County was everywhere in the war. We did have one final raid. It was by Major Jacob Bennett. He lived over around the community of Earls, I think, or so. It was around the Hopkins and Muhlenberg County line. He came in March 1865. He came in and raided, and he took some horses south of Greenville. He rode around town because he was worried about Captain Jeff Roark and his militia. And so he more or less circumvented Greenville, tried to avoid any conflict, went to South Carrollton. And, he was pretty mean to the storekeepers down there, took their money, took their stuff. But that was the last documented raid in Muhlenberg County. It was March 1865. We had a lot of rebuilding, and we think about the war damage, the physical war damage of all the houses and businesses and government buildings and everything. the rebuilding had to come from within. People had to heal their hearts, heal their
Yeah.
minds, become friends and family once again. And they did a great job of doing it. And I'm really
Hmm.
proud of the history. And we see in our reunions, you see the soldiers north and south, they're friends and family
Yeah.
once again. Marched home together, a lot of them, you know,
Hmm.
from battlefields from far away. And I'm really excited about this piece of Muhlenberg County history. I hope I was able to share with you some of the favorite points
Oh,
that.
oh yeah, yeah. It was great. I just find it for old Colonel Martin there to to be given that task. Hey, go burn down New York.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
and said, oh yeah, I can do that.
You know, he was the. Rother says he is the only Confederate soldier that was arrested and was sentenced to die for treason. Uh, but he was pardoned. Uh,
Yeah.
there is actually a document. I've seen it, and it is a petition by the people of Muhlenberg County, and I think everybody that lived there must have signed. This thing is
Yeah.
pages
Wow.
long on his behalf. He was arrested at his home place. He thought that he was good to go. Right, the war was over.
Yeah.
There was no animosities. They were done, and he came home, and there was a guy by the name of Nelson from over in Russellville that came up and arrested him at his home, took him to Greenville, tried to run away, right there next door to my boy's coffee shop, shameless plug,
Yeah.
Sipping Spoon. And Colonel Martin ran away, but they took him, put him in a dark, not so nice place. They sent him on to from the prison here in Kentucky. They sent him on up to New York where he was to be tried, but the president finally intervened and
Uh-huh.
signed a pardon for him,
Wow.
and he was
Wow.
free. He did quite well in the tobacco industry, which all the Martins were good tobacco people. I mean,
Hmm.
they did quite well in Muhlenberg County, and did well. Got
Yeah.
married a lady from McMinnville. When he died, apparently she had some issues and murdered their daughter. There's a lot of
Oh
strange stuff.
gosh.
That's how I
Yeah.
started. Yeah, that's a good story too. We'll
Yeah.
explore that one at one point if you want.
Yeah.
The sad ending
Yeah.
to the Martin legacy of that line. So,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
anyhow, you know me, uh, Jameson. I talk all day. What else are you thinking?
Well, I mean, that's pretty good as far as the book and everything that involves Muhlenberg and the Civil War. I'll remind people that the book has a list of everybody that has that connection that you mentioned earlier to Muhlenberg County in it. Some of your own family in there as well, and it's very much worth it. If you're wanting to learn some Muhlenberg County's history, I would highly recommend you getting it and checking it out. Um,
Appreciate it.
I can't remember how long it took you to put it all together.
Well,
Uh,
the way I look at it, I always call it a 10-year passion or a 10-year project. You know, at my age, I've spent most of my time reading and researching, even when I didn't call it research. I would study and learn these stories, and I was able to listen to some of the old historians tell these tales. And but from the time I decided to make this a standalone project of a book of almost 900 pages, um, I guess we're looking at about 10 years.
Wow. Yeah. Well, it's a lot of work, but like you said, not work when you enjoy doing it. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Anything else before we sign off?
No, I appreciate your program. I think what you're doing is wonderful, and
Mhm.
I'm glad I could be a part of it.
Well, we thank you again for coming on, sharing your wealth of knowledge, and we'll definitely get back together and just talk about Muhlenberg County in general and some of those other stories that you've brought up that may not be Civil War specific, but Muhlenberg County for sure.
I look forward.
All right. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can. from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.